In a lot of my recent videos, I've been talking about worldgen features that are great, features that could be better, and even some features that aren't needed at all. And now, in the latest Minecraft update, Mojang have just so happened to address many of these things. Coincidence? I think not. From improving legacy features to removing flowers, let's see what's new in Minecraft worldgen. Okay, so they didn't remove flowers. There's obviously some right here. However, one of the most significant changes that came with this 26.1 update is the removal of the flower feature, as well as the random patch feature. Random patches and their close neighbor, the flower feature, were previously responsible for handling a lot of the simple block features that you would find throughout many of the biomes, including short and tall grass and these wildflowers here in the birch forest. And as I've talked about before, this feature really wasn't necessary and was simply included as a legacy feature from some of early worldgen practices. You could recreate all of the behavior of random patches and most of the behavior of flowers by just using placement modifiers. And now, very conveniently, we have to do that after I've been talking about how we don't need random patches for the last few videos. So to experiment with this new procedure and some of the other worldgen changes, I think I'm going to do something I haven't done before and actually go to the end and make a custom end biome. My plan is to just kind of run down the list of all the worldgen changes in the changelog for this version and just start kind of adding things to make something resembling a pretty cool custom end biome. The end is of course mostly very barren, and I intend to keep it largely that way, but I do want to add some pops of color and just kind of anything that seems interesting from among all of the new or changed features. I don't intend for this to be any kind of real or genuine attempt to make a custom end biome that would actually fit in the game. This is just for fun. We obviously don't have a lot of blocks to work with as far as a block palette that would fit the end. The closest thing I can think of is things like amethyst blocks, so I think I'll probably incorporate some small and medium amethyst buds and random patches across much of the surface so that we can kind of simulate like a purple kind of grass without just using the actual short and tall grass. While I'm at it, I think I will also at least temporarily remove all these chorus plants just so I can get a better idea of the space that I'm filling with my own features, and I'll probably end up returning them in a slightly different kind of frequency using other kinds of placement modifiers. But for now, let's do away with the old method of random patches and place all of these small and medium amethyst buds using only placement modifiers. Alright, I really didn't feel like I was getting a full picture without the chorus plants, so I went ahead and added that back in, but I have changed how they spawn, and in fact, which biomes they spawn in. So here in the End Highlands biome, which is kind of centralized on most of the large End Islands, I've made the chorus plants generate just far less commonly, so you see a lot more of these kind of lone guys just kind of hanging here, rather than the forest that you would normally see in the forest, in fact, you see behind me. And the reason that these chorus plants are over here is because I've actually added the vanilla Minecraft chorus plant feature to the End Midlands biome, where they didn't typically generate. In fact, I believe no features generated in this biome previously. So really, I'm not just making one custom end biome, I'm modifying all of the end biomes, or at least two of them so far, to create just kind of a different vibe and a different feel. And with that in mind, I really like the visual and the color that is added by these little buds of amethyst that are populating the whole ground. And I'm handling these again without using random patches because it doesn't exist anymore. Instead, what's happening here in the placed feature is I'm attempting to place 5 of these amethyst bud simple block features per chunk, randomly distributing them on the X and Z axes within that chunk, and then projecting them to a height map. Then for each of those 5 attempts, I'm multiplying the number of simple block features that get placed by each of those attempts between 16 and 30 times, and then randomly offsetting them, giving them a little bit more random distribution around whatever that origin point happens to be, and that can include up to 4 blocks in the X and Z axes, negative or positive, as well as 3 blocks up or down. This means that some of the time those attempts are going to land inside of the end stone, and so when that happens, I'm simply checking if the block that it attempted to generate in is air, and if it is, it succeeds, otherwise it fails. This is pretty much almost identical to the way many of the features that previously used random patches in vanilla have now been changed to generate, and in fact this is something that I've had some practice with by incorporating it in my Overrealm project. However, while I like the color and the addition to the block palette that these small amethyst buds add to the end, it's clearly obviously not enough. So let's start taking a look at some other changes to features that we can incorporate here to experiment with. Discs are historically a very powerful feature, and they definitely still are, in no small part thanks to their shape and size. However, one of the main things that made discs unique was their ability to apply a set of rules to determine what block state they placed at each of their individual coordinates that they cover within the feature. During the 26.1 snapshots, this behavior was briefly also added to the Alter Ground decorator for trees, but now has been added as a completely separate block state provider that any feature can utilize if they use a block state provider. So when discs definitely still have their use, especially when you're trying to replace a wide area of blocks with a variety of rules, I think I'm going to use this new block state provider type with a vegetation patch for my new End Biome. Specifically, I would like to cover most of the End Highlands biome with grass. I'll get into why grass specifically in just a little bit. However, while I can change the color of the grass to better fit the biome or the dimension, I don't really want the brown of the dirt appearing on these hills, on the sides of these small, very subtle slopes that cover much of the end. So I think I'm going to use that rule-based state provider to make it so that anywhere where there is a total number of surrounding solid blocks, then we'll get some grass blocks. But where we have these edges, where the adjacent blocks are air, like this, and we'll place something else that is pretty close to the color that I select for the grass blocks and has a nice side texture that I think doesn't take away from the vibe that I'm going for here. I think I'll go with a color pretty close to Warped Nylium, since that already has some association with the Enderman, but I don't want to use exactly Warped Nylium for the same reason that I don't want the grass. I don't want the red of the netherrack here because I just don't feel like that's going to fit very nicely with the color scheme. This will also give me an opportunity to test another new feature in 26.1, sort of, which is some new block tags that have been added. A lot of the behavior of many different kinds of blocks is handled by tags, which is basically just inclusion within a list. So for example, warped roots have a tag now that decides what kind of blocks they're allowed to be on. And one of those is obviously warped nylium, because that's where they generate in the nether. But it doesn't include blocks like endstone or, okay, well, it does include grass apparently. I didn't know that. But I would like the warped roots to also be able to generate on endstone, and I think having warped roots as another sort of pseudo-random patch along with these amethyst buds will suit the biomes very nicely, especially once we add some more warped colored grass for them to sit on. Along with whatever block we decide to do for the borders here, probably just like warped warp blocks. Let's see how all that comes together. Oh, wow. Yeah, this is a very different color scheme to what the End is typically used to. I do think it works pretty well. I think it probably helps having that warped biome association with the Enderman already. So even though this is very different from any of the other colors that we already have here in the End, it doesn't like stand out too much. I think it especially helps that the grass ended up a little darker than I planned. It's not quite as bright as these warped warp blocks here, which I think is probably for the best. I don't know that I would want it to be like really popping out and in your face with the rest of the barren End. The rule state provider does seem to be working very well with the vegetation patches here. So the vegetation patches are covering a roughly between 4 and 7 block area, I believe, with the vegetation patch that it applies that rule-based state provider. We have some chances for some extra blocks on the borders here so that we get some areas where there's still some endstone, but it doesn't look like super square and stuff. But then anywhere within those vegetation patches that all of the surrounding blocks are solid, then we get those grass blocks, so we avoid that dirt texture. And then on the borders, we have the warped warp blocks. Warped roots obviously were already able to spawn on warped warp blocks as well as grass, but now they can be spawned and in fact placed on endstone, which is awesome. So even in these areas where the endstone has not been completely, I guess, overtaken by the grass and the warped roots and things, we have still some of the warped root blocks starting to creep in. You'll notice as well, I've also added grass blocks to the supports chorus plant block tag for the same reason as the warped roots. So now, even though I've replaced most of the surface of the End Highlands with grass, we're still able to get those sparse chorus plants because I've made them able to be supported by grass. Importantly though, there's actually separate block tags for whether a block supports chorus plants, so that we're able to have these nice tall chorus plant trees, and whether it supports chorus flowers, which determines basically whether players can actually plant the chorus plants on that block. And I have not added grass blocks to that. So there is still a little bit of incentive to actually grow them on endstone like they're supposed to, while allowing me to plant them on grass like a heretic. There's not really any reason for me to have done that. This isn't intended to be like a practical survival experience or anything, but it just made sense to me. Another new change in this update that I'm very excited about comes in the form of a bug fix and reintroduces water lakes. Lake features like this have been in the game for a very, very long time, and for a long time they included both lava lakes like this that we still have in the game, as well as water lakes that dotted much of the surface of many biomes. They were exactly like this, except they were filled with water, but at some point during the Caves and Cliffs update, a bug ended up being introduced that made it so lakes could not have water defined as the fluid for them. So they removed water lakes from world generation and didn't really consider it too much of a problem, it seems like, especially given the fact that they introduced aquifers as well as part of the Caves and Cliffs update, which added lots of underground water in probably more interesting ways. However, now that bug has been fixed. Lakes can have water defined as their fluid, and so even though vanilla Minecraft still doesn't use water lakes anywhere in World Gen because it doesn't really need to, I'm excited to start using it for my own World Gen projects where I feel like it makes sense. So let's get reused to using them by adding water lakes to my custom end biomes. I think I'll probably add them both to my end highlands as well as into the end midlands, though probably not the end barrens over here. Oh, an Enderman must have placed that down. That's another big reason why I'm not considering this like an actual practical survival data pack experience. Enderman can obviously pick up a lot of the blocks that I'm adding to these biomes, and I don't necessarily want to exclude them from the lists, the block tags of blocks that Endermen are allowed to pick up, because that would affect other parts of survival. So it's not actually particularly realistic that any of these blocks would or should be added to the end. I'm just doing it for fun. Now, adding lakes is one thing, but they're pretty straightforward. They're pretty simple features. So I think to elevate it just a little bit, I'll probably incorporate a similar mechanic as I'm doing for the new random patch procedure. So I'll attempt to place lakes in some number of chunks, probably not every single chunk, and then in every successful placement attempt, then I will multiply the number of placement attempts and spread them out a little bit so that we create kind of one larger unified lake instead of just a small simple one like we have with the lava lakes in the overworld. All of that should be pretty easy to add, so I will be right back. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more custom world gen structures and data pack content, especially if you work at Mojang. Thanks guys. To learn more about getting into custom world gen, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide that I've made for Data Pack Hub. And if you'd like to support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon. Like I said, I don't really plan for this data pack to be any kind of real or genuine survival experience, but I will probably make it available for my patrons to mess around with. This right here looks like a close example of what's likely a single lake, maybe just two lakes, or a small number of lakes that only got spread a very small distance away, and so we get something more similar to what we would expect from a lava lake in the overworld. However, if we come over here, we see what is clearly a much larger lake or pond being formed by several lakes that have all been placed in close proximity to each other. I've made it so that after they project to the height map, then they do their random offset without any Y spread, so that the water level obviously stays at the same height across all of the adjacent lakes. But this can mean, of course, that lakes that are a little bit further away from each other may be at different Y levels for their water. I think these two do happen to be the same, just as a matter of coincidence. But we obviously have this lake that's way downhill from over here. When you make a lake feature, in addition to defining the fluid, you also define the barrier, which is of course just the block that the rest of the lake is made of. This does support a state provider, however, regardless of the state provider that you use, it'll only randomly select between those states for each lake rather than for each block coordinate within that lake. At least that's how it was with like simple state and weighted state providers. Maybe it's different with the rule state provider, possibly worth testing. And so I've just made the barrier for all these lakes endstone, but I've made it so that the vegetation patches that place the grass are placed after the lake so that they can affect, in particular, the outer rim of these lake features. And I've even modified the rule for those vegetation patches so that they include water in their check for adjacent blocks to determine whether it should be a warped warp block. I've also changed the watercolor, but of course that was something we were already able to do, and with my shaders, there's still a little bit of a blue hue, especially against the warped warp blocks here, but as we get lower you can tell that they are just a very nice purple, very similar to the end sky that I have here with my shaders. Next up, I think I'd like to add some of my own trees to the End Highlands biome. Obviously, the chorus plants already add quite a bit of verticality, especially when you're walking along the ground rather than flying over, where you lose a lot of that scale. But because I've made the chorus plants less common here in the End Highlands compared to now where they spawn in the End Midlands, I think adding some additional tall features like trees would end up looking very nice. I'll probably make them out of warped stems just to, again, have some different colors going on compared to the things that you would normally find in the end. Obviously, this is just something that's already available in the Nether, and so while I don't think it's a perfect fit, it does have that association with the Enderman, and so I think for just basically an experimental pack like this, it does work very fine. Probably going to go with a cherry trunk provider. I think that's just kind of the closest thing that we can get as far as shape to the chorus plants here. It's not going to be a perfect match, but it's going to feel like it fits and belongs with the rest of the end. And for leaves, I think I'll probably use some obsidian. Again, not because it necessarily looks like it should be leaves, but certainly does look very alien. And I think to add to that even more, I'll probably do a pine foliage provider so that we get a nice little pyramid like this sitting on top of each of these leaves. Again, doesn't look too far from something like a chorus plant, just kind of a more extreme, older, or just otherwise kind of alien kind of plant. The main reason that I want to add trees, though, is to mess with those changes to the altar ground decorator of trees, like I mentioned earlier. I don't think I want to do anything too fancy with it, in particular because the ground here really doesn't have a whole lot going on to take advantage of rules, especially after the rules that have already been applied to the surface for the grass and the warp blocks. So I think I am probably just going to make it place amethyst blocks and just kind of a random spread like this. But I do still want to test it out, and I'll still have to use a rule-based block state provider to make it so it can only replace the actual ground and not the air that's kind of above the tree, for example. I already love trees, so this should be a pretty simple add. Let's get that implemented and get a nice distribution here in the End Highlands. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Again, clearly not something that Mojang would actually add, certainly not in this way. I think they would make some custom blocks, which I cannot do. Again, Mojang, I know you're watching. I know the reason we don't have data-driven blocks is because I would become too powerful, but I'm sure a lot of other people would like it too. The trees themselves, just kind of look fine. I definitely made them pretty tall because I wanted the branches to generate a little higher up most of the time. We do still get some small ones down here where most of that trunk height does get transferred to the branches, but not the end of the world there. The pine foliage placers definitely look very alien, which is of course kind of the point, what I was going for, and I don't think they look too terribly bad. Frankly, I think they look worse from above. If we come down to the ground, I think these tend to look a lot better, and they feel like they belong more with these chorus plants, almost like they're much older chorus plants. I also added these end rods as an attached to leaf decorator, so they hang from the bottom here. Not for any real reason, I just thought it was fun. The main point is obviously the amethyst blocks here, which again, I just made so they replace the whole area with amethyst blocks without any kind of actual rules or anything. Reasonably, I probably could have used a rule-based state provider to make it so that they replace grass blocks with a random mix of grass blocks and amethyst blocks so that it looks a little bit more natural. But right now, I just wanted to test with using the altar ground decorator at all. I don't think it looks too terribly bad, again, especially from the ground. One other thing that I implemented, and the reason that I wanted to use grass in the first place, is I wanted to test the new Bonemeal Behavior. I talked in a recent video about how surprisingly difficult it was, or at least strange it was, to make it so that specific custom flower features could generate when you bone meal grass, and seemingly because of that, Mojang have implemented a new, way more intuitive way for handling bone meal. So now, if you bone meal the ground, well, we got it right away. So normally you will have a chance. Oh, okay, we're getting a lot of it. Hold on. When you bone meal the ground, you always are going to get some short and tall grass. That's basically unavoidable regardless of the biome that you're in. However, now we have our very first configured feature tag, a tag that is a list of features that if you bone meal the ground and that feature is in that tag and in that biome somewhere, then it has a chance to generate when you bone meal grass in that biome. As you can see, I've added the warped roots and the small amethyst bud patch features in here, or really just the simple block feature since the patch feature doesn't exist anymore. So when you bone meal the grass here, you have a chance to get those along with the short and tall grass. But more importantly, you can now grow these custom trees without a sapling by just bone mealing the ground. You'll get them some of the time, and they come with the amethyst blocks. Reasonably, if I were doing this for a more serious project, then I would remove the altar ground decorator. Well, maybe not actually, because I guess the mega spruce trees do include their altar ground decorator, but I probably wouldn't for this. The important thing is that this allows us to not only define custom flower features to generate in biomes, but also allows you to be able to grow custom trees, like I mentioned, without the use of a sapling, because of course we can't add custom data-driven saplings to handle that with. And this can be expanded in some really interesting ways because technically only the configured feature needs to be listed somewhere in that biome. It doesn't need to actually be able to generate. The placed feature doesn't matter. So for example, in the End Midlands biome, I've actually added the End Tree feature as well as the Amethyst Buds and the Warped Roots feature as placed features that are not able to be placed, that have a count of 0. But if you do take some grass over here and bone meal the ground, then you do have a chance to be able to get those features. We got an amethyst bud over here, and even as far as over here, we got some warped roots. If I place some more grass, I'm sure we will be able to get an end tree in no time. There we go. So you don't even need a feature to actually place in the biome successfully for it to be able to grow from bone meal, and it doesn't have to be flowers. We can include any configured feature type in that tag, and bone meal will be able to grow it from grass. This is so awesome, and the only thing that I feel like is missing is a block tag for blocks that can be bone mealed. That by default would just include grass, I'm sure, but it would be awesome if we could have it include other things like end stone so that we don't even have to transport the grass into the End Midlands in order to get that. Just some food for thought, Mojang. My end biomes are looking pretty good, but I think I want to add a few more new features, or rather some renamed features. These boulders of mossy cobblestone in the old-growth taiga biomes were previously called forest rocks, and they were slightly configurable. You can and could define what block they're made of. But they had some additional weird behavior that caused them to generate a little bit undesirably, or in undesirable places. The feature has now been renamed to Block Blob and now has a can place on field where you can define a block predicate filter for what kinds of blocks it's allowed to get placed on. Ice spikes also got a very similar treatment. Where previously they were completely unconfigurable, we can now define not only what block they're made of, but also what blocks they can be placed on, similar to those block blobs, those previously called forest rocks. And we can also define what blocks they are able to replace. So normally they're able to replace things like stone and dirt and things so they can burrow down into the ground, but we can make it so they can't replace anything, can only replace air and whatever. And because of this, the feature has been renamed from Ice Spike to just Spike. So I think I would like to add some spikes of my own to my end biome, probably made of amethyst like this, and I'll make it so that they can only replace air, maybe grass blocks also, so that they can be a little bit dug into the ground, but not end stone, so that those long pillars aren't able to burrow down underneath the islands. Not sure if they would actually do that, but I would like to avoid it entirely. And then, although I play with night vision, much of this biome is kind of dark and it feels very strange. The end rods add a little bit of light, but with how much life is here, I don't know if I like the darkness that it exhibits in the same way that the rest of the end has. So I'll probably add some block blobs, some boulders, of pearlescent frog lights. That looks terrible with my shaders. Some block blobs of pearlescent frog lights just to kind of dot the area a little bit. They're not going to be super overpowering and dominating here. In fact, I'll probably make them a little bit less common here in the End Highlands and more common out in the Midlands and the Barrens. But even from way over here, you can see it adds just a nice glow to the grass and the amethyst buds that are surrounding it. Let's see how these two new updated features behave. So here in the end highlands, I made not only those pearlescent frog-light block blobs, but also the amethyst spikes themselves, less common since there's obviously plenty more going on, and I made both of them more common out here in the midlands and I believe as far into the barrens. Maybe only the block blobs are in the barrens. It's hard to say how much the amethyst actually works here when incorporated in a vertical way like this, but it's pretty much one of the only blocks that I feel like fits color palette wise. And we have the precedent of the other amethyst blocks that we've added through some of the other features before. I do like the sensation that the pearlescent frog lights add with these block blobs, but they don't necessarily work as well out in the end barrens because the end stone is already so light. It's not necessarily bright, you still get that kind of dim feeling when you don't have night vision like I do, but the way that the glow behaves against the end stone just isn't as effective as it is against the grass there. I really appreciate Mojang opening these two features up with more configuration, especially the ice spikes that previously, again, were not configurable at all. It says a lot that they're seemingly able and willing to spend the time to open these features up even when they don't intend to use the behavior themselves, at least as far as we know so far. Like for example, the lakes, we know that they're going to be adding the sulfur caves, and we saw from the Minecraft live footage that the sulfur caves include lakes that are filled with water. They clearly fixed that bug so that they could have water lakes in their sulfur caves, but they didn't really need to make these changes to the spikes as far as we know. So I can only conclude that they did so because I've been talking about how unconfigurable ice spikes are and how nice it would be to be able to configure them. Now, with all that said, there is still a little more work that could be done. The spike feature as well as the block blob feature still don't support state providers, so you can only define the single block that they're made from. Otherwise, I'd really love to be able to use like a weighted state provider to have little bits of budding amethyst in here with some randomness, or even a rule state provider so that I could have a more interesting kind of mixture of blocks based on various other conditions and surroundings. And same with the pearlescent block blobs as well. I have no idea what goes into making a feature support a state provider over just a regular single state, but it sure would be nice to have just that little bit of extra configurability and elevate these beyond B tier. Remember to like and subscribe for more custom world gen, structures, and data pack content. If you'd like to learn more about getting into custom world gen, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide. And to support the channel and participate in NPC fights like this one at the end of every video, please consider joining my Patreon. Congratulations to today's winner, Randall Clausen, and thanks for watching!